Hello everyone. Today we're going to discuss the entirety of the modern era for AP European history. I know this is the least tested section on the exam, but it is very important that you know what you're talking about just in case it's your DBQ topic. Before I get into this video, I just want to give a shout out to Ms. Heileman. Thank you for sponsoring this video and this wonderfully painful project. Now let's knock this out. First, I'm going to give you a little background before we get into the real meat of the modern era. Prior to the modern era, the democracies of the world were, although mainly the U.S., were engaged in a Cold War with the Soviet Union, which lasted from the end of World War II to the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, spanning about 45 years. This conflict triggered many proxy wars across the world, such as the Vietnam War, the Korean War, the Iraq-Israeli War, and the Iraq-Israeli War. This Cold War also included an arms and technology race that helped to bring the world some of the most incredible technology that we know today. Now, with this background, I'm going to break down the political, social, and economic trends of the modern era. The politics of the modern era were much improved from that of the Cold War, mainly because of the Charter of Paris for a New Europe, which was signed in 1990. This was a summit that contained all of the major powers of Europe as well as the United States and Canada. This established better diplomatic relations worldwide and began the process of disarmament with the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or START, which was focused on keeping the world safe by getting rid of everybody's stockpile of nuclear weapons from the Cold War. It also set out to bring in the age of democracy and a market economy for the former communist regime of Russia. This was the main transition between an era of conflict to an era of peace in modern Europe. Prior to the treaty, the political systems of Europe were quite simple. All of Europe practiced democracy while the Soviet Union was communist, and they would later dispose of the communism and adopt a new economic and political system with reforms enacted by Mikhail Gorbachev. This policy was called Glasnost, which began the democratization of Soviet Russia and would later lead to the Communist Party in Russia to dissolve. This happened because the Glasnost policy eliminated key portions of Soviet ideologies such as censorship. Censorship was key in Soviet Russia because if the citizens knew of all the atrocities that the government had committed, they would revolt, which is exactly what happened once the policy was put in place. Anti-communism riots broke out all across Russia, and eventually the party could not handle it, so they dissolved and the communist regime had finally fallen. Although while the Soviet Union in the East was dissolving, all the Western European nations were unifying under the European Union. This was established in 1992 and helped the many nations of Europe to act in the global community as one entity. It allowed for anyone with an EU passport to transport freely between countries in the EU, as well as freedom of movement for money and goods. Members of this organization work as one entity on a number of different topics, such as environmental issues, education, and public health. This is a good segue into the next portion of this video, economics, because the EU was founded off of an economic organization called the European Economic Community. This was established in 1957 to create a single market for all six of its members. Its original goals were to gradually reduce all tariffs and have freedom of movement for labor and capital. Although once it merged into the EU, then new economic policies were put in place, such as the establishment of the European Monetary Union. This standardized the currency for all members besides Britain, who decided to keep their currency of the British pound. But other than Britain, all EU countries used the Eurodollar, which simplified commerce even further with simple monetary transactions, leaving behind all the messy conversion rates. With all these improvements for commerce and the improvement of the economy, there were also a couple of traumatic economic events during this time period. Although this one falls under both political and economic, the energy crisis of 1973 was a very important event. This was triggered when the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Companies, or OPEC, placed an oil embargo on Canada, Japan, Netherlands, the UK, and the United States. They did this as punishment for intervening in the Iraq-Israeli war. This forced the affected countries to pass restrictions on oil consumption, and once the embargo was lifted, the price of oil skyrocketed from $3 a barrel to $12 a barrel. This forever changed diplomatic and political relations with the Middle East. The second and final event that we will be talking about is the economic recession of 2007 to 2008. This occurred in the States, but it had a great effect on Europe because of international investment. This was triggered when the U.S. housing market collapsed after a run of constant growth. The reason why this was so globally devastating was the European governments were capitalizing on the market growth through investment, but once it crashed, they lost a lot of their money, plunging their countries along with the U.S. into recession. This was very noticeable if you look at the gross domestic product for major European nations during this time, because you can see a very abrupt drop once the housing market crashes. Next, we're going to move into the social changes during the modern era. First, let's discuss the major advancements in women's rights. During this period, women were really binding together to protest for equal pay and equal treatment. A major step during this movement was the formation of the National Organization for Women in 1966. Their mission was to pass laws enforcing equal pay for equal work, maternity leave and affordable daycare, the right to divorce, legalizing abortions, and protection against rape and physical assault. This organization was successful because they were able to legalize abortion in almost every single country. This organization was also much needed because of the spike in women across the world who were working part and full-time jobs. The next major change you see during this era is the change in the behavior for this new generation's youth. The new generation during this time was called the baby boomers, and they had a very different attitude than kids of past eras. In the modern era, kids were very rebellious in this movement called counterculture. The youth were trying to find new ways to defy their parents, some of which including listening to rock music, using illegal drugs, and increased sexual behavior. This was a major change to prior generations because kids were expected to obey their parents and be behaved and courteous. Thank you for watching my latest video, and if you like what you see, sub to my channel. Not really though, because this is a school project, but hoping you enjoyed and you learned something today. See ya.